Hello there, long time no video. Before I start with this video, I want to say a few things. Firstly, hello to all my new subscribers. I was in the middle of writing this script when I noticed that my subscriber count had pretty much quadrupled over the course of about 3 days, apparently because one of my videos was starting to get recommended. That's awesome, so thank you to all of my new subs, and all of my older subs who have hung around during my periods of hiatus. Secondly, I want to talk about the direction of this channel, and the niche I want to fill in regards to Middle-earth and Lord of the Rings related content. As you probably know, there are already popular channels like Men of the West and Geek Zone who cover the major parts of Middle-earth lore. Their videos are informative and well made, so I don't think there's a point of jumping on that train. I don't really have much more to add. I'm more interested in making videos that are philosophical and speculative, so instead of simply dropping lore bombs and info dumps, I'd much rather go into the depths of why things happened, how things happened. Real-life comparisons, alternative history, in-depth explanations. My Gondor Army Size video, which has blown up recently, is a good example of that, where I speculate and then try to explain something using the information that Tolkien gave us, but never really went into full detail himself. So more of a why is the lore like this, rather than a here's the lore, learn it type channel. I have so many video ideas, it's just about the time and motivation really, and kind of thinking about what people would be interested in watching. So anyway, here's the video. Why was Arnor so weak compared to Gondor? So, unless you're a complete Middle-earth casual, then you've probably heard of Arnor, Gondor's not-so-fortunate sister kingdom in the north. Whereas Gondor would go through periods of declines and then revivals, Arnor kind of just deteriorated and went straight onto life support very early in the Third Age. Unlike Gondor, Arnor never experienced a golden age, it never experienced an extended period of wealth and prosperity. In fact, it seems like Arnor's most prosperous period was in the brief period of time between its founding and the War of the Last Alliance. That's a period of really only about 100 years. Okay, so let's do a quick Arnor history lesson. Arnor was founded by Elendil in the lands of Eriador, following the downfall of Numenor at the end of the Second Age. It fought against Sauron during the War of the Last Alliance, but the war and the following events resulted in both the losses of Elendil and Isildur. Arnor would decline rapidly throughout the Third Age, eventually splitting into 3 successor kingdoms known as Arthedain, Cardlan, and Rhudaur, following a civil war. Several hundred years later, a 4th kingdom known as Angmar would rise in the north, led by the Witch King, who was actually the leader of the Nazgul. Rhudaur, Cardlan, and eventually Arthedain would fall to Angmar by 1974 of the Third Age, although Angmar itself was soon destroyed by Gondor. Following these catastrophic battles, the surviving population of Arnor would become the Rangers of the North, until Aragorn eventually refounded the kingdom in the Fourth Age following the defeat of Sauron. There you go, I've condensed 3,000 years of history into about 30 seconds. Alright, so now we have the history of Arnor, but what about the question? What went so horribly wrong for Arnor compared to Gondor? I mean, Gondor didn't have an easy task throughout the Third Age either. Like Arnor, it went through a civil war, a plague, numerous invasions, yet whereas Gondor survived and even prospered at times, Arnor weakened and died a slow, painful death. If Gondor and Arnor were at a party, Arnor would be the guy who has to be taken to hospital after drinking a six-pack, whereas Gondor would drink an entire case and, although he'd be in a bad state by the end of the night, he'd ultimately pull through into the morning. I'd like to draw attention to a small comparison between the two kingdoms. When the Witch King overran Arnor, a Gondorian fleet was sent north to defeat the Witch King. When the fleet was docked across Lindon, the surviving men of Arnor were amazed at how big the army was, and interestingly, this is Gondor after 500 years of decline, and this is a force that wasn't considered big by their standards. In fact, an entire Gondorian army had been annihilated only 30 or so years earlier. So a weakened Gondor sent a mediocre force to Arnor, and the Arnorians were amazed at the size. Now, that either shows that Arnor had fallen really far, or that Gondor was just that powerful, and honestly, I'm inclined to believe the former. So how could the two kingdoms face similar challenges, yet end up with vastly different outcomes? Let's try and answer that. When Iluvatar decided to turn Numenor into Middle-earth's Atlantis, 9 ships under Elendil escaped to the shores of Middle-earth. 5 of these arrived in what would become Gondor under Isildur and Anarion, and 4 of them arrived in Lindon under Elendil and founded Arnor. Now, 9 ships full of refugees isn't enough to found 2 major kingdoms that become capable of fighting in a large-scale war in only a century's time. But thankfully for them, these lands were already inhabited by both Numenorian colonists and middlemen. But to put it bluntly, the situation in Gondor was far better than the one in Arnor. You see, the Numenorian version of colonialism had been far from perfect in Arnor, or Eriador as it was known. When the Númenóreans arrived in Eriador, they cut away much of the region's forests to fuel their own shipbuilding industry, which pissed off the native middlemen who lived in those forests. More of those forests would be destroyed during the War of the Elves and Sauron, which resulted in many of the surviving middlemen fleeing north and founding Bree, fleeing into Dunland, or fleeing into the forest of Iron Vaughan. Although the Númenóreans ended up defeating Sauron, these people still hated the Númenóreans, thus Númenórean influence in Eriador was relatively little, at least compared to the more southerly lands. There were colonists, but few compared to the richer, warmer lands to the south. For example, the Númenórean port at Londare in Eriador declined in importance once richer ports like Peligir and Umbar were established in the south, and Londare itself was abandoned very early in the Third Age. This leads us to the lands of Gondor. When the Númenóreans started becoming tyrannical towards the middlemen of Middle-earth by giving them the middle finger, those in the lands of Gondor somewhat escaped that treatment thanks to the close proximity of the port of Peligir. Peligir was founded by the Faithful in the 23rd century of the Second Age, the Faithful being the good Númenóreans, as opposed to the King's Men who were the bad Númenóreans. Thus, relationships between the Númenóreans and the middlemen of Gondor remained pretty good, with the exception of the Men of the Mountains. So, when Isildur and Anarion arrived in Gondor, they found a vibrant, populous, friendly region, whereas when Elendil arrived in Eriador, he found a relatively desolate region inhabited by natives who didn't exactly have a good opinion of the Númenóreans. To put it simply, Isildur and Anarion were welcomed with open arms, whereas there weren't a whole lot of people to welcome Elendil at all. The difference in initial population size can be pretty easily noted. When the Númenóreans arrived in Gondor, they founded 3 cities, Osgiliath, Minas Anor, and Minas Ithil, and this was along with the city of Peligir that had already been there for over 1,000 years. When the Númenóreans arrived in Eriador, they only founded 2 cities, Annúminas and Fornost, and Annúminas would become depopulated very early in the Third Age. Basically, Gondor had a large enough population to sustain 4 major cities as well as numerous other large named towns, whereas Arnor only had the population to sustain 2 major cities and only for a small amount of time. Alright, let's move beyond the founding and into the Third Age. Now, despite the War of the Last Alliance actually taking place in some of Gondor's territory, Arnor actually came out of the war worse than Gondor. Tolkien actually specifically mentions that Arnor never fully recovered from the devastating loss of manpower it suffered during the War of the Last Alliance. So clearly Arnor took huge losses in that war. But how could they not have recovered from them? Surely the population would have recovered in a few generations. Well, not necessarily. Firstly, I want to point out something. When we mere mortals on Earth experience 100 years, we usually have 3, possibly even 4 new generations born within that time span. To the Dunedain, it works a little different, as in those days, their lifespans were generally longer than 200, meaning in the space of 100 years you're likely only going to see 1, possibly 2 generations being born. So, repopulation and population growth takes longer. And this leads me to my second point. You see, almost all nations in Middle-earth are agrarian in nature, so in other words, most of the population would work within agriculture. So when your army returns severely depleted, you lose potential for population growth, not just through population loss, but because you also have less hands to work the fields. Now, you might be thinking, this is Middle-earth, they don't have to play by the same rules. And you'd be right in most cases, but when it comes to food, it doesn't just magically grow itself. Food requires people to grow it, and the less people, the less food. Sure, you have less mouths to feed, but less mouths to feed also results in the abandonment of arable land, and a population in an agrarian society can only grow if it has enough food to allow it to grow. And if the society doesn't have enough food, you get starvation, and starvation is generally considered to be quite bad. And population growth itself is also affected by geography. Gondor, for example, is a temperate land, covered in fertile plains and valleys which are fed by many rivers. Even more importantly, much of Gondor's population resides on the coast, allowing for fishing to be a major industry. However, Arnor, whilst not freezing by any means, is colder, experiences harsher winters, and is generally less fertile. There are less rivers, but more forested and hilly regions that generally aren't good for farming. And most of the population lives inland, so fishing is not an option. There is less arable land, so the output of Arnor's agriculture is also impacted by geography, which isn't as well suited to farming as Gondor's geography. So, in other words, Arnor's population was never as high as Gondor's. It took a huge hit at the War of the Last Alliance, and its population growth would be naturally slower than Gondor's due to a colder, less hospitable environment. You can probably see where I'm going with this. Arnor was much weaker than Gondor due to its suffering major population problems from the very beginning. These problems continue to manifest themselves as the Third Age continues. When Arnor splits into Arthedain, Cardolan, and Rhudaur, we see that Annúminas becomes depopulated and abandoned. Why would Numinas be depopulated and abandoned unless Arthedain did not have the population to support the city? You don't just abandon a perfectly good city for no reason. In Cardaland, we see the successor kingdom claim vast tracts of territory in the south, but these lands are mostly empty of all people. They only belong to Cardaland in name, and they exert no real authority over these lands. In Rudau, the local Dunedain are outnumbered and eventually overthrown by Hillmen, the very same people who are descended from those natives the Númenóreans originally helped displace. And these Hillmen end up allying with Angmar against Arthedain and Cardaland when the wars against Angmar begin. So you have a native populace there, but they actually also hate you, which is bad. Once the war with Angmar begins, these population problems become even more dire because we see that both Cardaland and Arthedain become highly centralized states. You see, both of these nations don't have the immense natural barriers that Gondor has, like the Anduin or the White Mountains. When there is a nearby enemy power that is determined to exterminate you, you want to be protected by an army or by fortifications. You don't just want to be on a random farm out in the wilderness. This leads me to believe that after Angmar rose, Arthedain and Cardaland, despite controlling a lot of territory on paper, didn't really have much power projection outside of their respective capitals of Fornost and the Barrow Downs. And they didn't really need that power projection because no one really lived there. That's another key difference between Arnor and Gondor. In Gondor, the Heartland regions were never really under threat until the end of the Third Age. In fact, no foreign invader ever made it across to Anduin until the Morgul host did during the War of the Ring. Whereas in Arnor, the Heartland regions were always under threat from Angmar, and whenever the Arnorians were fighting, they were generally fighting within their own territory. In 1409 of the Third Age, we see Angmar's highly successful invasion rampage through Cardaland, essentially reducing the kingdom to a rum state in the Barrow Downs. The last of these inhabitants are wiped out during the Great Plague of 1636, so all of the Dunedain who were originally spread across Arnor, only those in Arthedain actually remain at this point. And in Arthedain, we know it isn't going much better at this point either. In 1601 of the Third Age, the hobbits arrive in Arthedain and are granted the lands of the Shire by the King of Arthedain, because they're no longer inhabited. These are perfectly good lands, fertile and nestled deep in Arthedain's territory, but they're simply given away because no one actually lives there anymore. This is over 300 years before Arthedain actually falls, and there isn't actually enough people left living there to live in perfectly good, safe lands. Arthedain actually manages to avoid most of the Great Plague that wiped out Cardaland, but it doesn't matter at that point because the situation is essentially irreversible. They're just waiting to be put out of their misery. In 1974 of the Third Age, when Angmar finally destroys Arthedain, we're left with the interesting little tidbits that the Witch King never actually destroyed Bree or the Shire. Why not? Because despite belonging to Arthedain, it seems like neither Bree or the Shire were actually really under Dunedain authority at that point. If they were, then surely the Witch King would have looked to destroy them as well. As far as the Witch King seemed to be concerned, Fornost was Arthedain, and Arthedain was Fornost at that point. And after the fall of Arthedain, places like Bree, Farbad, and the Shire all continued on as if nothing had really changed. It paints a stark picture that by that point in time, Arthedain was essentially reduced to whatever remained in Fornost, possibly even down to tens of thousands of people. And after Angmar is defeated, there are so little people left that Aranarth, son of King Arvedui, doesn't actually think it's worth it to re-establish the kingdom at all. So, in conclusion, as I mentioned earlier, Arnor was much weaker than Gondor due to its suffering severe population problems even during the very first years of the Third Age. The lands of Eriador were never as heavily populated as Gondor, due to former devastation and probably also due to climate. Shortly after Arnor was established, it suffered huge casualties in the War of the Last Alliance, which created the snowball effect of population problems heading into the Third Age. Following that, unfriendly native populations, civil wars, wars with Angmar, and the effects of the Great Plague basically helped Arnor's population fall into a terminal decline from which there was no return. And obviously, when a kingdom is suffering depopulation of that magnitude, it becomes weaker economically, it becomes weaker militarily, it abandons land, and it is usually eventually conquered by a foreign power. If you recall back to the start of this video where I mentioned the men of Arnor being amazed at the size of Gondor's army, well, now it's much more easier to understand why. Moral of the story, take advantage of a 200-year lifespan by having a dozen babies instead of just one or two. So, thank you for watching. I hope you found it interesting. I know it was a relatively long video for something I probably could have just wrapped up in 1 or 2 minutes, but what's the point of talking about Middle-earth if I'm not going to ramble on about it? Cheers to everyone, stay well, and remember, don't gift your best land to a bunch of weed-smoking midgets.